evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday. Yom Rishon. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on a Sunday? Yehud in South Carolina, Paul in the Great Northwest, Lucy in Minnesota, Joe in the Inland Empire, Sharon in New Jersey, Bella in Florida, Shandor in the Bronx, Bill in Missouri, Guy in Ohio, John in Maine, Ella's in the house, Elanit in Silver Spring, Marjorie in Georgia, Belle in Texas, Joseph enjoying the new tractate in Massachusetts. Where are my English majors? Who recognizes the reference in the title of today's class? Let me know before we get there. Good fences make good neighbors. That is a quote. Who said it? Our daf today is page 4, daf Daled. Here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud, continuing our discussion of the first Mishna in chapter 1. And God willing, we will get into Mishnah number 2 as well. Bill on time. Robert Frost, of course. Yes, sir. That is correct. And we'll get to it in a moment. I'm going to read a little portion of Mending Wall, the poem by Robert Frost. Well done, sir. Okay, we got a little bit of a head start on page 4 yesterday. So we're about halfway down the page of page 4a. And the Mishnah taught, in a place where it is customary to build a wall of non-chiseled stone or chiseled stone, or small bricks or large bricks, so they must build a partition with that material when they come to divide their courtyard or their garden, or as we'll see, even a field. Now the Gemara asked, what does the word everything come to add? Why doesn't it just say it is done in accordance with local custom or regional custom? Why does it say everything is in accordance with regional custom? And the Gemara answers, it serves to add a place where it is customary to build a partition out of palm and laurel branches. In such a place, the partition is built from those materials. We follow the regional custom, even if the regional custom is a very, or let's say a relatively weak and unstable fence compared to stone or brick. Now, the Mishnah teaches, therefore, if the wall later falls, the assumption is that the space where the wall stood and the stones belong to both of them to be divided equally. Right? They both participated in making the wall, so if the wall falls down, so then they equally own the materials, and the place where the wall stood is where it's going to rebuild, and they're sharing ownership of the materials that collapsed and responsibility for rebuilding it. Now the Gemara questions the need for this ruling. Isn't it obvious that this is the case since both neighbors participated in the construction of the wall? And the Gemara answers, no, it is necessary to teach this law for a case where the entire wall fell into the domain of one of them. Alternatively, it is necessary in a case where one of them already cleared all the stones into his own domain, lest you say that the other party should be governed by the principle that the burden of proof rests upon the claimant, meaning if the other party should have to prove that he has been a partner in the construction of the wall. Right? In other words, when you're seeking to extract some kind of damages or monetary payment from another party, well, the one seeking to get the money or the property out of the hands of the other one has the burden of proof. So if the walls just happen to fall all on the side of one of the neighbors, you might have thought that the one who comes along and says, hey, half of those stones are mine, I paid for them, you can't say that they're all yours. No, he doesn't have that burden of proof because they were co-responsible for putting up the fence, and it doesn't matter if it collapsed. When it collapsed, all the stones fell onto one side, and that's where the presumption we're going to work from, not the presumption that the one seeking to extract damages or property has the burden of proof. And having said that, I'll just read a little excerpt from this Robert Frost poem. I was an English major in college, and this is one of my favorite poems in college. Love Robert Frost. I won't read the whole poem, although I love it. It's called Mending Wall. It's not terribly long, but this is not an English class, so I'll just come in the middle here, where the poet writes, so that at spring mending time, we find them there, right? That there's let me start at the beginning. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that sends the frozen ground swell under it and spills the upper boulders in the sun and makes gaps even two can pass abreast. The work of hunters is another thing. I have come after them and made repair where they have left not one stone on a stone, but they would have the rabbit out of hiding to please the yelping dogs. The gaps, I mean, no one has seen them made or heard them made, but at spring mending time, we find them there, right? The gaps in the fence. So I let my neighbor know beyond the hill, and on a day we meet to walk the line and set the wall between us once again. We keep the wall between us as we go, to each the boulders that have fallen to each the boulders that have fallen to each. Sort of not the same precedent that we have in the Talmud, right? We co-own the boulders, but we can say what falls to your side, what falls to my side, as long as we understand that half the rocks are yours and half the rocks are mine. So similar principle, but not quite the same. So it says the poem, to each the boulders that have fallen to each. And some are loaves and some so nearly balls, we have to use a spell to make them balance. Stay where you are until our backs are turned. We wear our fingers rough with handling them. Oh, just another kind of outdoor game. One on a side, it comes to little more. There where it is, we do not need the wall. He is all pine and I am all apple orchard. My apple trees will never get across and eat the cones under his pines, I tell him. He only says, good fences make good neighbors. Spring is the mischief in me, and I wonder if I could put a notion in his head. Why do they make good neighbors? Isn't it where there are cows that we need fences? But there are no cows. Before I built a wall, I'd ask to know what I was walling in or walling out, and to whom I was like to give offense. Something there is that doesn't love a wall, that wants it down. I could say elves to him, but it's not elves exactly, and I'd rather he said it for himself. I see him there bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand like an old stone savage armed. And he moves in darkness, as it seems to me, not of woods and the shade of trees. He will not go behind his father's saying, and he likes having thought of it so well, he says it again, good fences make good neighbors. A lovely poem, and I ended up reading the whole thing, I guess because I love it so much. Okay, let's get back to our neighbors splitting the cost of repairing the fence. Okay, where was I? So the Mishna continues, and similarly with regard to a garden, in a place where it is customary to build a partition in the middle of a garden jointly owned by two people, and one of them wishes to build such a partition, the court obligates his neighbor to join in building the partition. And the Gemara comments, this matter itself is difficult. On the one hand, you said, and similarly with regard to a garden, in a place where it is customary to build a partition in the middle of a garden jointly owned by two people, and one of them wishes to build such a partition, the court obligates his neighbor to join, meaning join in the cost of building the partition. So one can infer that ordinarily, where there is no custom, the court does not obligate him to build a partition, to share in the cost of the partition. But say the latter clause of the Mishnah, where it says, but with regard to an expanse of fields, in a place where it is customary not to build a partition between two people's fields, and one person wishes to build a partition between his field and that of his neighbor, the court does not obligate the neighbor to participate in building such a partition. So one can infer from this that ordinarily, where there is no custom, the court obligates him to participate in building the partition. So the Gemara explains the difficulty. Now that you said by inference that in an ordinary garden, the court does not obligate him to build a partition, is it necessary to say that the court does not obligate him to build a partition in an ordinary field? Clearly, in a field, there is even less need for a partition, as there is less damage caused by exposure to the gaze of others. Now that we decided 2 days ago that damage by sight is damage, invasion of privacy is one of the reasons for building a wall. Well, in a field, you don't really need the wall for that purpose. Right? It's almost like Robert Frost saying, good fences make good neighbors. Why? You just inherited that idea, but what's the logic behind it? So Abaye said, this is what the Tana is saying. And similarly, with regard to an ordinary garden, and also in a place where it is customary to build a partition in an expanse of fields, the court obligates him to build a partition. So Rava said to him, if so, what is the point of the word but that is mentioned afterward in connection with an expanse of fields, which seems to indicate that the issue of fields had not yet been addressed. So rather, Rava said that this is what the Tana is teaching, and similarly, an ordinary garden is treated like a place where it is customary to build a partition, and therefore the court obligates him to build a partition. But an ordinary expanse of fields is treated like a place where it is customary not to build a partition, and therefore the court does not obligate him to build one, right? So for the most part, and unless there is an actual custom to the contrary, for the most part, we expect that gardens are treated like courtyards, where there usually is a custom to build a partition, and therefore, if one of the neighbors wants to partition, he can obligate the other neighbor to participate in its cost. And for the most part, absent a custom, a local custom to the contrary, when we're talking about fields, for the most part, it is not the custom to build a wall between them. And so if one of the neighbors wants that wall and the other one doesn't, the one who wants to build can build, but he can't obligate his neighbor to participate in it. Now, the Mishnah taught, rather, if one person wishes to erect a partition, now this is in a case where he cannot obligate the neighbor to participate, either because the custom is not to build a wall, or because there is no such custom, so he can't obligate the neighbor. So in that situation, not only can he not obligate his neighbor to participate in building the wall, but he also cannot build the wall right on the property line. Since he can't obligate his neighbor to participate, he has no right to encroach on his neighbor's property by building the wall right on the property line, meaning that some amount of that thickness, half the thickness of the wall, will extend into the neighbor's property and reduce his property that's available for his use. So now, where we don't have a custom to build a wall, a partition, and somebody wants one, so he has to build that wall entirely on his side of the property line. Now, the advantage to him is that if this wall should ever collapse, obviously all the materials of that wall are his, because he paid for them and he built that wall. And that will be the case even if those stones fell over into the neighbor's yard, then nevertheless remains the property of the one who built the wall. But what the Gemara is now going to advise him, what the Mishna advised him, is that he should mark such a wall so that the neighbor understands that it was built on the side of the property line of the one who wished to build it and built it. So the Mishnah taught, rather, if one person wishes to erect a partition, he must withdraw into his own field and build the partition there. And he makes a border mark on the outer side of the barrier facing his neighbor's property, indicating that he built the entire structure of his own materials and on his own land. And the Gemara asks, what is the meaning of a border mark? And Rav Huna said, he bends the edge of the wall toward the outside. And the Gemara suggests, let him make it on the inside. And the Gemara explains, in that case, his neighbor might also make a mark on the outside, that is on the side facing his own property, and say, hey, that wall is both mine and his. And the Gemara responds, if so, there is a concern about such deception. If so, that is, there is a concern about such deception. Well, now also, when the person who builds the wall makes a border mark on the outer side of his wall, his neighbor might come along and cut it off and say the wall is both mine and his. And so the Gemara answers, such a cut would be noticeable and the deception will not work. Right? So the idea is, if you're building the wall on your side, you want to kind of communicate to your neighbor that, hey, you built this wall, the wall's on your side, you own the materials, and you make this mark on the outer side, either by tilting the top of the wall outward or by building into it an extra row of stones like this. You see, there's the wall, and there's like an extra row of stones along the top added to the outside, and that would be this kind of border mark. And so the Gemara says, well, if you're worried that your neighbor will, use deception and try to remove your border mark, well, that would be noticeable. And if you tried to add a border mark to the other side, that would not be so easy to, prove that that's what he did, as in the case of when he cut off your own border mark, and that's why you make your border mark on the outside of your wall. And that would be the custom. Now, there are those who say that in answer to the question, what is the meaning of a border mark? Rav Huna said, he bends the edge of the wall toward the inside. And the Gemara suggests, let him make it on the outside. And the Gemara explains, in that case, the neighbor might cut it off and say the wall is both mine and his. And the Gemara asks, well, if so, that is that there is a concern that the neighbor will act in this deceptive manner. Well, now also when the person who builds the wall makes a border mark toward the inside, his neighbor might add a border mark on his own side and say the wall is both mine and his. And the Gemara answers, an addition is noticeable and the deception will not work. And the Gemara asks, but doesn't the Mishna teach that he makes the border mark on the outside and not on the inside? And the Gemara comments, yes, this is a difficulty. Now we're on page 4b. The party who builds the wall should smear it with clay up to a cubit at the top of the wall on the outside. And the Gemara suggests, well, let him do this on the inside. And the Gemara explains, in that case, his neighbor might also do it on the outside, that is on the side facing his own property, and say the wall is both mine and his. And the Gemara responds, if so, that is, if there's a concern that the neighbor will be so deceptive, well, now also when the person who builds the wall, who smears it with clay on the outside, his neighbor can come along and peel off that clay and claim that the wall is both mine and his. And the Gemara explains, peeling off clay is noticeable and the deception will not succeed. God willing, we should all have neighbors that wouldn't act in such a deceptive manner, nor would they feel the need to, and we don't have such a, unneighborly situation. Now the Gemara asks, if he builds a partition of palm branches, then how does he make a border mark? And Rav Nachman says he directs the tips of the branches toward the outside. The Gemara suggests let him direct them toward the inside. And the Gemara states, if so, he directs the branches. If he directs the branches toward the inside, his neighbor might also do the same to the outside, that is to the side facing his own property, and claim that the partition is both mine and his. And the Gemara objects, if so, that is, if there is concern for such deception, now also when the one who builds the partition directs the tips of the branches toward the outside, the neighbor could come along and cut off the tips and throw them away and say the partition is both mine and his. And the Gemara counsels he should smear the tips of the palm branches with clay. And the Gemara comments, now also the neighbor might come and peel the clay off. And the Gemara answers, peeling is noticeable. So Abaye said, one who builds a partition of palm branches has no remedy to prove who erected it, except with a written document. The neighbor should draw up a document stating that he has no claim to the space or to the partition, because they belong exclusively to the other neighbor. Right? If you can't get your neighbor to participate in building the wall with you, so then get him to sign a document that says, okay, I have not participated in building the wall. Sal built the wall entirely on his side out of his own materials. And then if the wall ever has problems, Sal can rely on that to say, these are my materials, my wall on my side. Now, the Mishnah teaches, nevertheless, in a place where it is not customary to build a partition between two people's fields, if they made such a partition with the agreement of the two of them, they build it in the middle, i.e. on the property line, and they make a border mark on the other side, on both sides. Therefore, if the wall later falls, the assumption is that the space where the wall stood and the stones belong to both of them to be divided equally. Rava from Parzika said to Rav Ashi, neither this one nor that one should make a border mark. Rav Ashi said to him, no, this ruling is necessary in a case where one of them went ahead and made a border mark for himself, so that if his neighbor does not make one as well, the first one will later claim, or could later claim, that the wall is entirely his. Rava from Parzika asked him, and is the Tan of the Mishnah teaching us a remedy to be used against a swindler? And Rav Ashi said to him, but isn't the former clause of the Mishnah's ruling also a remedy to be used against a swindler? Why are we making a border mark? And Rava from Parzika said to him, granted, in the former clause, the Tana taught the law that if one wishes to build a partition between his own field and that of his neighbor, he does so at his own expense and on his own land. And due to the need to teach that law, he also taught a remedy to be used against a swindler. But does he teach a halacha, a law, in the latter clause, so that he also teaches a remedy to be used against a swindler there? And Ravina said, here in the latter clause, we are dealing with a barrier made of palm branches. This is to the exclusion of the opinion of Abaye, who said, one who builds a partition of palm branches has no remedy to prove who erected it except with a written document. He teaches us, Ravina is teaching us that a border mark does suffice even for a wall of palm branches. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 1 here in chapter 1 of Tractate Bava Basra. Now, Mishnah number 2. I believe that my trusty whiteboard, will be of benefit here, because we are talking about a situation like this, right? Where Reuven owns these fields, and Shimon owns just this little field, and his field is surrounded, at least on 3 sides, and later we'll even say on 4 sides, by the fields of Shimon. In the first case, this would be a public thoroughfare, and in the latter case, Reuven's fields entirely surround Shimon's field. Says the Mishnah, with regard to one who surrounds another on 3 sides, that is, he owns parcels of land on 3 sides of the other person's field, and the outer one built a partition on the first, the second, and the third sides, right? So Reuven puts a fence here and here and here. The court does not obligate the neighbor who owns the inner field to contribute to the construction of that partition if he does not wish to do so. And Rabbi Yosei says, if he arose and built a partition on the 4th side of the field, then the court imposes upon the owner of the inner field the responsibility to pay his share for all of the partitions, right? So in other words, if Reuven puts a partition here, here, and here, now he's doing that on his own side, right? We're not obligating Shimon to participate in a partition between his field and Reuven's, even though Reuven surrounds him on 3 sides, because Shimon never asked for a partition. This is a place where there is no obligation to create a partition between fields. Reuven wanted that, and Shimon didn't ask for it. But what Rabbi Yosei is saying is that if then Shimon himself goes and makes a partition here on the 4th side, then he has expressed a desire to enclose his field and protect it from the outside. And once he shows that he would prefer to be separated from the outside, even though his fence is only here along the road, then Reuven can say, well, you wanted to protect yourself, so now split the cost of the fences that I put around you, because you showed that you would prefer your field to be protected from outside intrusion. That's the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef. Not just the minority opinion, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, that if Shimon adds that 4th fence, then he's going to be obligated to share in the cost of the other 3 segments in the border that he shares with Reuven around his field. He said that, right, Rabbi Yehuda says that Shmuel says the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, who says that if the owner of the inner fence arose and built a partition on the fourth side of the field, the court imposes upon him the responsibility to pay his share for all of the partitions. So the Gemara comments, it is no different if it was the owner of the surrounded field who arose and built a partition on the fourth side, and it is no different if it was the owner of the surrounding field who arose and built a partition on the fourth side. The law is the same in both cases. Now that seems odd, but what is Reuven doing building a fence on this side if this is a public thoroughfare? Presumably it's because Reuven owns the street as well, which could certainly be, maybe it's Reuven's driveway. And then if he built this fence around Shimon, then I think what we're saying is this might be a place where it is customary to build fences. When it was only 3 fences, it was incomplete. When he builds the fourth side, then Reuven has separated his property entirely from Shimon's property, and that's when he can obligate Shimon to share in the cost. Presumably, if it's a place where you could force your neighbor to share in the cost if you built a complete fence between your property and his. Now, it was stated that the Amoraim, the sages of the Gemara, disagreed with regard to the following point. Rav Huna says that when Rabbi Yosef said the court obligates the owner of the inner field to pay his share for all of the partitions, he pays in accordance with what the other person actually spent when he built the partitions. That is, the owner of the inner field must contribute his share according to the cost of the partition that his neighbor built. In other words, this is a very tough thing on Shimon. Reuven, who has all these much bigger fields, presumably is a wealthy neighbor, at least compared to Shimon. So what is Shimon obligated in? Is he obligated to share in the cost of what it would cost to put up a reed fence, very inexpensive fence? Or is he obligated to share in the cost of what Reuven actually spent? And maybe what Reuven wanted, was a thick wall made of chiseled stones, 2 layers, gravel in between, adobe on the outside, paint, plaster, etc. Maybe little, filigrees and decorations. Maybe Reuven spent a lot of money creating that fence. And now the question is Shimon going to be obligated in sharing half the cost of that expensive fence or half the cost of some, minimum value fence that would have done the job of separating but didn't have to be so expensively produced? So Rav Huna seems to be saying, no, whatever Reuven spent, Shimon's going to have to pay half of that. Now, Chia bar Rav says he must pay his share for all of the partitions in accordance with the reduced assessment price of reeds, right? Chia bar Rav is saying, no, just that he pays half the cost of any of the cheapest fence that will do the job of separating between one field and another, not half the cost of, God only knows how expensively wrought this fence that Reuven conceived and then executed. The owner of the surrounded field can claim he had no desire for a more substantial partition than one made of reeds. So the Gemara attempts to bring a proof from what we learned in the Mishnah. With regard to one who surrounds another on 3 sides, that is, he owns parcels of land on 3 sides of the other's field, and he built a partition on the first, second, and third sides, the court does not obligate the neighbor who owns the inner field to contribute to the construction of the partition. By inference, if he also built a partition on the 4th side of the field, then the court does obligate the owner of the inner field to contribute to the building of the partition. And so the Gemara continues with its proof and says, say the latter clause of the Mishnah, where it says that Rabbi Yosef says, if he arose and built a partition on the 4th side of the field, the court imposes upon the owner of the inner field the responsibility to pay his share for all the partitions. So the first Tana and Rabbi Yosef seem to be stating the same ruling. Since they stated the same thing, granted, according to Rav Huna, who says that the owner of the inner field pays for all the partitions in accordance with what the other person actually spent when he built them. This is the difference between the first Tana and Rabbi Yosef. That the first Tana maintains, yes, he pays for all of the partitions in accordance with the reduced price of reeds, but not the larger sum of what he actually spent. And Rabbi Yosei maintains that he actually pays half the cost of what the outer field owning neighbor actually spent. But according to Chia Bar Rav, who says that he pays his share for all the partitions only in accordance with the partition fashioned from inexpensive reeds, then what difference is there between the first Tana and Rabbi Yosei? If, according to the first Tana, he does not give his share for all the partitions in accordance with the reduced price of reeds, what does he give? And the Gemara answers, if you wish, say that there is a practical difference between them with regard to the wage of a watchman. The first Tana maintains that, yes, since his field is safeguarded by the partition which surrounds it, the one who built the partition can demand payment of the wage of a watchman. In other words, since he created a fence on three sides between his own land and the land of the inner field, the owner of the inner field can say, hey, I didn't want that. I didn't ask for it. I'm not going to contribute any money to it. The owner of the outer fields can say, hey, but I built a partition and that's going to stop any animals on my land from getting into your land and grazing on your crops. That's a value to you. Now, maybe you don't want to pay the cost of half a fence, not even the cost of half of a fence of reeds, which is very cheap, but at least pay me what you would have spent to have a man watch your field and chase away any animals who came in to graze on your crops, because I'm providing that protection to you by building this partition on the three sides that separate between your field and mine. The watchman and Rabbi Yosei maintains that he can demand the other share for all the partitions in accordance with the reduced assessment of the price of reeds, not just the price of a watchman, but he could even ask for the cost of half a fence, albeit at the reduced price of a inexpensive fence made of reeds. And if you wish, say that there is a different practical difference between these two opinions with regard to partitions built on the first, second, and third sides of the inner field. The first Tana maintains that the owner of the inner field must give to his neighbor money for the partition built on the fourth side, but he's not required to give him money for the partitions built on the first, second, and third sides. And Rabbi Yosei maintains that he must also give him money for the partitions built on the first, second, and third sides. Now, the Gemara suggests another difference between these two opinions. If you wish, say there is a practical difference between them with regard to the issue of whether the partition on the fourth side was built by the owner of the surrounding field or by the owner of the surrounded field. And this is because the first Tana maintains that the reason the owner of the inner field must contribute to his share to the entire expense is that he arose and built a partition on the fourth side of his field. Therefore, the court imposes upon him the responsibility to pay a share of all the partitions. Why? Because his action of adding the fourth partition around the fourth side of his field demonstrates that he wants a partition protecting his field from the outside. But if the owner of the outer fields arose and built the partition on the fourth side of the inner field, then the owner of the surrounded field must give him only his share of the value of the partition on the fourth side and not the cost of building the other three sides. And Rabbi Yosei maintains that it is no different if it was the owner of the surrounded field, the inner field, who arose and built a partition on the fourth side, and it is no different if it was the owner of the outer field who arose and built a partition on the fourth side. If either one of them arose and built a partition on the fourth side, the court imposes upon the owner of the inner field the obligation to pay his share of all the partitions, because now there is a completed separation between the inner field and the outer fields. Now, the Gemara reports another version of this last answer. There is a practical difference between them with regard to the issue of whether the partition on the fourth side was built by the owner of the outer field or by the owner of the inner field. And the first Tana maintains that even if the owner of the outer field built a partition on the fourth side, the owner of the inner field also gives him his share of the cost of the partitions. And Rabbi Yosei maintains that only if the owner of the inner field arose and built the partition on the fourth side does he give the owner of the surrounding field his share of the cost of the partitions. And why is that? Because he reveals that he is pleased with the partitions. But if the owner of the outer field built a partition on the fourth side, the owner of the inner field does not give him anything, as he can continue to claim that he has no interest in having partitions around his field. Now, it is related. Now we're on page 5a, getting a little head start on tomorrow, but I'm close to done, so please get in your questions or comments now. And now an incident to illustrate how this works. It is related that a man named Ronya had a field that was surrounded by fields belonging to Ravina on all four sides, right? So now it's more like this, right? Boom. Okay, and so this is Ronya and this is Ravina on the outside. Okay, so Ravina surrounds Ronya on all four sides. Presumably Ronya has some kind of a path that he can just get out. But bottom line, his field is surrounded by Ravina's fields on all four sides. Okay, so what happened? Ravina built partitions around his fields and said to him. So Ravina built, right? That's just the way the fields were laid out, but then Ravina actually built a wall surrounding Ronya's field. Okay, so he built the four partitions, all four sides, and Ravina then said to Ronya, give me your share of the expense in accordance with what I actually spent when I built the partitions, i.e. half the cost of the partitions. This would be the largest claim that could be levied against the owner of the inner field. Right? I want you to pay half the cost of all four partitions, and I want you to pay the half of the actual money that I laid out to build those partitions, because they divide between my field and yours. So even though it's a very nice, expensive wall, you pay me half, even though you didn't decide to do this, you didn't agree to do this. Ravina built it without consulting with Ronya, and then he wants half the money for it. Ronya did not give it to him. So then Ravina, lowered his expectations. Ravina said to him, well, then give me then at least your share of the expense in accordance with a reduced assessment of the price of reeds. Not half of what I actually spent, but half of what it would cost to put up the least expensive kind of fence, one made of reeds. Ronya did not give it to him. Ravina said to him, all right, well, then give me at least the wage of a watchman. Right? Since I have surrounded your field, I have protected it from any animals, deer coming in and grazing on your crops. That's a real value to you. Normally you'd have to pay a watchman to do that. So give me at least what you would spend to protect your crops by having a watchman there. But Ronya did not give even this to Ravina. One day, Ronya was harvesting dates. Ravina said to his sharecropper, right? Ravina, I guess to his own employee, said to his sharecropper, go take a cluster of dates from him, right? From his neighbor Ronya. So the sharecropper went to bring them, but Ronya raised his voice at him in protest. Right? In other words, Ravina sent his employee and said, go get a cluster of grapes from Ronya's land. And Ronya said, no, you can't do that. That's my land. Ravina said to him, you have revealed that you are pleased with the partitions and the protection that they provide to you. So even if it were only a goat that entered your field, wouldn't the field need safeguarding to prevent the goat from eating the dates? And Ronya said to him, if it were only a goat, doesn't one need merely to chase it away? No partition is required. And Ravina said to him, but wouldn't you need a man to chase the goat away? Pay me at least the wage of a watchman. Ravina came before Rava to judge the matter. So Rava went to Ronya and said, go appease Ravina with what he expressed his willingness to be appeased with, namely the lowest level of damages, the wage of a watchman. And if you don't pay that, said Rava to Ronya, I will judge you in accordance with the ruling of Rav Huna, in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yosef that we just read earlier today, and you will be required to pay half the cost of the partition based on what Ravina actually spent. So presumably at that point, Ronya paid the cost of the wage of a watchman, so he wouldn't have to pay half the cost of the actual expenditures on that fence. Now, incidental to that episode, the Gemara relates another encounter between Ravina and Ronya. Seems like good fences make good neighbors. That wasn't happening between Ravina and Ronya. So Ronya once bought land adjoining property belonging to Ravina. And Ravina considered removing him due to the law of one whose field borders the field of his neighbor. When land is up for sale, the owners of the adjoining fields have the right of first refusal. If one of the neighbors is willing to match the highest price being offered to the seller, sort of by the general market, then that neighbor has the presumptive right to purchase the property because it's obviously an advantage to your neighbor if he has two fields side by side. So if I'm selling my field and some third party out from out of the public will offer me 1,000 dinars for it, then I have to offer that price of 1,000 dinars to my neighbor even if I don't like him. And because it's a benefit to him. We've learned that halacha before. Now, where this gets interesting, right, is if there's multiple neighbors on the same parcel, so each neighbor has that same right. So who are you going to sell it to? Right. So Ravina considered removing him due to this law, that when land is up for sale, the owners of the adjoining fields have the right of first refusal. If one of the neighbors is willing to match the highest price being offered to the seller, that neighbor has a preemptive right to purchase the property. And if somebody else buys it, that buyer can be removed. Now, since Ravina owned the adjacent property, he thought he enjoyed the right of first refusal. Rav Safra, the son of Rav Yeva, said to Ravina, "People say 4 dinars for a large hide, 4 for a small hide." Meaning, since Ronya also owned land bordering the desired parcel, you cannot remove him, even though his plot of land is smaller than yours. Right? Ravina thought that he should have had the right to purchase that land that went up for sale, that I guess Ronya bought, because he bordered that land on, had much longer border with it than Ronya did. But Ronya was a neighbor just like he was, and he bought it first, so Ravina was not going to be able to remove Ronya. And so basically Ravina won the first battle and lost the second. And that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 2 here in chapter 1. Tomorrow, God willing, at 6 p.m. Pacific, the regular time, we'll pick it up with Mishnah number 3. Let me take a couple of questions, if there are any. Give me a moment. Okay. Here we go. Questions. Come on, Google. On Bava Basra 4, Sharon, when I read this need for local requirements for design and materials, I found myself thinking of homes where there is an HOA, right? Homeowners agreement, homeowners association. Was it prohibited to use a design different from local custom if both parties agree? Very interesting question, right? So we have local custom that we use to adjudicate a situation where one wants a fence and the other doesn't. Okay, we're going to settle that according to local custom. But what if the two neighbors agree to something that violates the local custom, but they like it between themselves, so that's what they do? That may create a problem, right, when one of them moves away. Now somebody moves in and finds something that is there that is not according to local custom. We haven't dealt with that question yet, but I think it's a really interesting question. And says Joseph, like a good neighbor, the Gemara is there. Is that Allstate, right? The Allstate insurance jingle. I think that's it for the questions. Very good. Great to be learning with you today and to share a little Robert Frost. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, 6 p.m. Pacific, the regular time. Have a great night.